Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this meeting of the County Council's Strategy and Resources meeting. It's good to see so many. Is this not working? Is it? Can people hear me? People down there can hear. But is that better? That's going to be very disconcerting. Okay, so welcome to this meeting of the County Council Strategy and Resources meeting. Thank you. Sorry? And performance, indeed, very important, and performance. It's good to see so many people here this morning. I think the first thing on the agenda is probably apologies for our absence, but it looks as if we've got a pretty full house. This is very impressive. So thank you all for being here. I'm slightly delayed in finding my agenda. I think the next thing on the agenda, oh no, I've got my notes. Here we go. Perfect. Please be aware that this meeting is being live streamed and that a recording of the meeting will be available to view on the County Council's website. There is no fire alarm test scheduled for today. If the alarm sounds, I will adjourn the meeting and we will make our way downstairs. And we've done apologies. And then disclosable interest. Does any member wish to declare a disclosable pecuniary interest or non-statutory disclosable interest? I see no indications, but if there is a need to declare an interest at any point during the meeting, please feel free to do so. The next thing is that we are being asked to approve the minutes of the Strategy and Resources and Performance Committee meetings on the 31st of October and the special meeting on the 28th of November as an accurate record. If any member does not agree to those minutes being an accurate record, if you could indicate now. I see no indications, and therefore I will sign those minutes in a moment, and I will assume that the minutes should be agreed and the recommendation to approve the minutes is carried. If there are any objections, could you indicate? We'll assume that that's carried. The next item is petitions and public questions. Sorry, the action log. Thank you. An updated action log is also included with the public papers. Most of the actions are ongoing with an explanation. Are there any comments on the action log? Again, no comments. Thank you. Item 3 is petitions and public questions. We have received no petitions or public questions for this meeting. Item 4 is the integrated finance and monitoring report for period 7, 2024 to 25, and the head of finance will introduce the report. Morning, Stephen.
Hello, thank you, Chair, and good morning, everyone. Hope you can hear me okay. This report presents the consolidated management accounts of the Council for period 7 of 2024-25, which is the end of October. It sets out the forecast revenue and capital budget position for the current year and the position of the balance sheet. It also sets out several recommendations for the committee dealing with financial management. On the revenue position, which is summarised on page 36, this report sets out an improved forecast outturn variance for the year of £7.5 million, down from a forecast position of £9.6 million at the previous report to this committee. That is a 1% forecast variance and represents pressures that we, like many councils, are facing from services such as placements for children in care and home to school transport, where increasing demand for services has outstripped supply and driven up costs. We are continuing to face pressures from waste disposal centre not being operational, from lower than expected income from key pieces of income generation work, and also now from higher than expected capital financing costs. These pressures are partly mitigated through a lower than expected level of growth in costs for adult social care this year, with budgeted growth for older people services in particular not fully materialising, and then through additional grant funding and business rates income. While this is an improved position, we are continuing to work to identify further mitigations, and an overspend at year-end is ultimately funded from the Council's General Reserve, which has implications for business planning in terms of ensuring that reserve remains at its minimum necessary level, as the committee will see in the next item. We're also now forecasting an increased overspend on the Council's dedicated schools grant-funded budget, summarised on page 38 of your reports. There's now an expected in-year pressure of over £18 million on that, and a consequent cumulative deficit to carry forward of around £58 million. Work continues with the central government through the Safety Valve programme to try and address these pressures and to reduce cost growth on those budgets. While on the subject of revenue, Chair, and taking the recommendation slightly out of order, recommendation D deals with the reserve drawdown from the elections reserve to defray the cyclical costs of the county's 4 yearly elections. So elections are managed by the district councils, and are generally paid, or the majority of the costs are paid in the year preceding them, i.e. this year. A sinking fund reserve, which this reserve is built up through a budgeted annual contribution and then drawn down or intended to be drawn down in the year in which the costs are incurred. Turning to capital, Chair, in the summary on page 41, a balanced year-end position continues to be forecast for the Council. One directorate is forecasting an underspend at this stage, but across the whole Council, we're not yet forecasting to meet our full level of assumed slippage, and indeed capital spend to date is at a higher level relative to budget than in recent years. On specific capital schemes, the committee is asked through recommendations A and B and the information on page 44, firstly, to note changes to schemes funded by specific income, and secondly, to add a capital scheme to the programme for a BMX pump track in March, funded by external contributions, which is ultimately expected to be transferred to Fenland District Council. And then, Chair, if it's all right with you, I'll hand over to the Executive Director of Children, Education and Families to speak to recommendation C. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you for being here to respond on this one.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Excellent. So in relation to recommendation C in the period 7 report regarding the proposed design and build of Alconbury Secondary School, following discussion and vote at Children and Young People's Committee on the 26th of November, and having taken further advice, officers are no longer moving this recommendation.
Thank you. Michael, do you want to say something?
Only therefore to summarise and to be really clear to councillors, officers are only moving recommendations A, B and D, and as the Executive Director of Children, Education and Families has just said, not recommending moving recommendation C.
And just to be clear, that means that the issues that are related to recommendation C will need to come back to be dealt with at future committees, either this committee or the CYP committee, depending on how things work out. But I am quite happy that we will discuss recommendation C at this meeting, but the recommendation will not be moved. Okay, Steve.
Sorry, I need to ask a question on what that actually means. So first of all, for the sake of the public, recommendation C was to deny the Alconbury School being fitted with a sprinkler system, which was the recommendation of the CYP committee, and we came to this meeting fully prepared to argue this through, and the Conservatives put in an amendment saying we want to value engineer this so there is a sprinkler system. This has now been, according to you, removed. But that leaves this in a grey area. I'm not really clear whether that means you will be putting in a sprinkler system, whether, as you said, it will go back to some committee, you'll go back and represent denying a sprinkler system to the CYP committee, whether you're actually taking on board our amendment that you're going to try and value engineer it to fit a sprinkler system, just removing it. So we don't know what you mean by that. So tell us what you mean by that, and then we'll know how to handle the debate.
So my understanding is that by not moving that recommendation, it would mean that the decision of the CYP committee stands. So the expectation is that there will be a sprinkler system. What is unclear at this point is how much that sprinkler system will cost. There's an assumption in the CYP committee papers on what that costs, but further investigation, both from you and from others, indicates that cost seems on the high side. However, we don't know what the cost is, and therefore it would be sensible to go and find out before bringing back a cost to the council. I hope that's helpful.
In which case, I think it's appropriate to move an emergency amendment on the day, because what we've got is we've kind of got a minuted grey area of what may or may not happen, whereas what I'm hearing you saying is the SRMP committee is inclined to take on board the CYP committee recommendations, which it actually needs to acknowledge and take on board and say that as an amendment. So we say the SRMP committee now ask officers to go away and try and fit a sprinkler system to Alconbury Weald and then report back either to the CYP committee or here. But we actually need this to go away as some kind of amendment, I believe, or at the very least, with your permission, Chair, if you won't accept an amendment on the day, an instruction to go in the action log to report back, okay?
I think the suggestion of it going on the action log to come back to our next meeting with a report on what the conclusion, I mean, there will have been a CYP committee meeting in between this meeting and the next meeting of SRNP. And I would suggest that we have an item on our action log for our next meeting to report back what has happened at the Children and Young People's Committee, and therefore whether any further action is required in terms of budgets for this committee. Would you be happy with that as a way forward?
Yes, I would. There was a secondary element of what was reported to the CYP committee as a factual report from the fire authority has since fire authority response has since been found out to be inaccurate. The officer has apologised for that. So if that could go back in front of the committee in the public domain, that would be appropriate as well. Thank you.
I'm certain that the CYP committee will receive a future report on that. I think it, I think there are things that it might be useful for the CYP committee to do, but I would be hesitant to be telling them what should be on their agenda or not on their agenda. So, but I'm sure that they will want to investigate that further. Thank you.
Just in terms of governance, is there any element of the 6-month rule that applies to committees like it does to the councils? Is there a special exemption needed, or is it just simply that's okay to do? I don't know. That's a question for the governance.
I think we've been advised that there's no reason why that can't happen. So, thank you. Good. I hope that that's dealt with that item. Thank you very much, Martin, for being here. Are there other questions on other elements of the integrated resources and performance report for Stephen? Steve.
Yes, thank you, Chair, and thank you for the report, Stephen. I've got a question on 1.2.4 in the adult sphere. It says growth funding is now not required. What does that actually mean? How much? Where was the growth funding coming from? And if it's not required, what does that actually mean in its purest form, please?
So I think that's describing what I tried to set out in my introduction, which is that funding was allocated to budgets for demand growth and inflation growth in the business plan for 24-25. Due to the numbers and costs of people coming through, that funding isn't required, and that's what's driving the underspend that is reported on the adult health and commissioning budget line. And you'll see some information in the next item on the budget for next year about what the implications of that are going forward.
Yes, thank you for that. These are the cuts that are in the adult social care budget going forward. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions for Stephen? I don't see any. In which case, I think we can probably move to either note the report. Oh no, we've got a series of recommendations. Is everyone happy for us to take A, B, and D together? Steve?
Yeah, after questions for officers, it's normal to go into debate.
Absolutely happy to take debate.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I wanted to comment on a couple of things, but the main one is the BMX pump track in March, which of course you'd hope I would support, and I do wholeheartedly. I also want to make some comments on it. I mean, it's kind of the narrative here I find a little bit upsetting compared to the actual project, because the project is a great project. It's been led by local people from the very start. Councillor Jan French, one of our county councillors, actually put £100 into a bank account to actually get this project off the ground. £50,000 has been raised through sponsorship that way. County Council did come along and help rescue this at one point in its delivery scheme, but it just feels like the flavour of this £100,000 project that is beneficial to Peter of March. The narrative has almost made it a County Council project where it's very much the local people and the generous sponsorship of those companies involved. I think Mick George would be one of them who I want to thank, as well as all of those people that put it forward. So I'm very much in favour of this project. I know that not everybody wants these things near them, but we have a huge park in March now that's been delivered and increased over a period of time. And it's very right that the park is for everybody, not just certain sectors of society, and giving an outlet for youngsters and people that enjoy this kind of venue. It's a real tribute. So very much in favour. I know the other local members of March, Councillor Jan French in particular, is an architect of this, and others are very much in favour. So I hope this will be approved today. In terms of the rest of the paper, I'm disappointed, of course, with the underspend that this joint administrations failed to get a grasp on. I'm disappointed with the safety valve that they're so far off of. But again, we go to narrative. When we talk about things like, you just read any part of this paper and you see things like Cambs County Council is on track to deliver £18 million of the £34 million savings. That means Cambs County Council has failed to deliver £16 million of the 34 savings that they promised. This was what the business plan was built on last year. This is what went through all the committees. At committee after committee, you were told some of these are unrealistic and they shouldn't be in there. And it's by fluke chance and an underspend they're actually going to deliver at the end of the year. 16 million, that's almost 50% of your £34 million savings are not going to be delivered. And we spotted these because when they came in front of us, they ended up in nice round figures, 400,000 here, 500,000 there, 300,000 there. Those aren't realistic savings plans. Those are nice round figures pulled out the pluck of a hat. I remember Councillor Alan Sharp saying very vividly about the home to school transport. This will not be delivered. A number of these will not be delivered. But when we get the report in front of us, it's almost like praise. We are on track to deliver 18 million out of 34 million savings. I find that the narrative is always in the positive when actually the truth of the matter is this is a very negative comment. So yeah, I don't think the county council's performed very well. I don't think they've handled their budget very well. And if you had have handled your budget better and been closer to the baseline, we wouldn't be looking at the 5% tax increase that we're looking at in the next set of papers. So thank you, Chair. I will be supporting the recommendations, but I do think that we need to take some of the spin out of these papers.
Thank you for those comments. Are there any comments from anybody else on the paper? If not, I will just respond very briefly to say that I don't recognise the picture that you're painting. I think it is always the case that councils have ambitious savings plans because the pressure on local government spending continues to be relentless and very, very difficult to manage. When you have ambitious savings plans, it is always likely to be the case that some of them will be over met and others will be under met. And that is the case with this, that actually the budget for adult social care is not what we expected it, and the budget for children's social care is also not what we expected it. They are demand-led services. We need to be responsive. So I don't think there were any other comments on that paper. And I haven't heard anybody speak against the recommendations. Just to pick up on the point about the BMX track, I think that that definitely is something that it's delightful that the council's been able to support. But I absolutely recognise that it's a small support, that actually it's a community project, and the more we can move the council to be supporting communities to do things, the better. So that's great. Any further comments on this paper? If not, I haven't heard anybody speak against the recommendations or any suggestion that we wouldn't take them as a block. So if people are happy to support the recommendations, I will take them NEMCON. Anybody who wants to speak against, if you could. Sorry, Lorna.
Just to be absolutely clear for the record, we're talking about recommendations A, B and D.
Indeed, absolutely clear for the record. Recommendations A, B and D to be taken together. Perhaps it's easier if we do vote on them. All those in favour, if you could indicate now, please. I think that's unanimous. Any against? No. Thank you. Okay, and then we will move on to item 5 on the agenda, which is the business planning and budget setting, which will be introduced by Stephen. Different Stephen.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning to members, and apologies for my slightly late arrival today. I was on a ministerial webinar regarding the devolution white paper, which meant I was slightly delayed, so apologies for that. In terms of the report before you today, this is the draft business plan and budget setting paper for the County Council for the period 2025 to 2030. As members will be aware from your previous meeting in October, we have already through this committee approved the current version of the Council Strategic Framework, the consultation and engagement strategy, which also included the 2 phases of engagement on the draft business plan and budget, the first of which is concluded and is reported upon in one of the appendices to this report, the second phase of which commenced on the 9th of December and from memory runs through to the 9th of January to inform the final draft of the business plan and budget that this committee will receive in January, subject to the determinations of this committee in January. It will then move forward to full council consideration in February. The report itself sets out for members' consideration the draft business plan and budget, as I've said, particularly framed around the strategic framework, the Council's approved 7 ambitions, and of course the recently approved change strategy, which is very much around how this organisation will reform and reshape going forward. Attached to the report are the various appendices members would expect to see, including the medium-term financial strategy, associated financial tables, capital strategy, proposed fees and charges, and as I've already said, the Phase 1 engagement survey results. In terms of the recommendations set out in the report, this is for committee to consider today, bearing in mind this is the draft. The final draft for member decision at Strategy, Resources and Performance Committee will come forward in January, as I've said. Chair, I'm not planning to offer further introduction at this stage, but you have myself, the Executive Director of Finance and Resources, Service Director Finance and Procurement, and Service Director Policy Insight and Change in attendance, should members have questions for officers prior to moving to debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So questions for officers on this? There must be some. Steve.
Yes, I have one I want to bring to light, although I have had a response from Stephen Word privately. I'm not happy with the response and I want to actually air this in public. So there is a section of the report that relates to consultation responses, and in the consultation there was a direct question to the public saying, would you agree to a 4.99% increase if that meant paying for more vital services such as improvements to highways or adult social care? I haven't got it in front of me. I'm been trouble connecting. So the question was very specific in its aims. In the consultation response in the document, it says that 52% of the public agreed to support a 4.99% increase if it helped improve vital services, bearing in mind that we want a fairer, just greener county, and that there are severe pressures on us. I do not like or agree with the fact that you can put a response to a consultation and change the wording of the question. So the question was very specific about would you agree to it, and mentioned probably what vast majority of public, when they thought they was answering this, looked out their window and saw the terrible state of our roads and pavements and thought, you know, the only thing in this world I would spend more money on is actually if they sort that out. So to get a 52% response to that, and then to drop that from the consultation response that's printed in the document, I think is wrong. I submitted an amendment to correct this, and I was ruled out of order by the monitoring officer on the grounds that this is not a presented by the joint administration. This is an officer, in this case Stephen was the chief executive's paper, and therefore to correct the actual narrative as opposed to the recommendations is actually to put an amendment to what should be factually correct. I do not believe it's factually correct. The response I've got is couched in the words that there is background in the document and the consultation that justifies those wordings. Now, whilst I don't think that this is factually correct, and I know I've already been overruled, I want to highlight this to the public. I'm going to try and put this into some kind of context, an analogy, if I may. We've got New Year's Eve coming up, and I plan to have a very nice night out with my dear wife, June. And if I said to my dear wife, June, when we were going around John Lewis, I said, oh, you know, the blue dress looks nice, but the red dress at £200 more looks even better. Why don't we get the red dress with your money? And of course, we'll make sure that you get the matching shoes and handbag to go with that. And she goes, yes. And then I come home a week later and we've got the red dress, but I bought an air filter for the car and a new ironing board because they're needed. That's the difference between what's printed in the consultation response in the papers for me and what the question that was asked. It distorts what people thought they were responding to. I'm not happy. I'm not happy that the response fails to correct this, and I think this needs airing for the public.
Thank you. I am sure your comments will have been noted. Steve, Stephen.
Chair, thank you. Yes, absolutely no Councillor Count's comments, and as he's indicated, he received a full written response in request of this matter yesterday, which I'm happy to circulate to all members of the committee. Also very happy to have that explanation included in the notes, if that would be helpful, or attached to the action log. But I'm very clear that the position articulated to Councillor Count is the factually correct one. This is not factually incorrect. It is not distorted, and the link to the associated and explanatory context that formed part of the Phase 1 engagement made very clear that was aligned to the County Council's strategic vision and ambitions, including creating a greener, fairer and more caring Cambridgeshire. So whilst noting Councillor Count's discontent and unhappiness with the position remains unchanged from me. Thank you.
Thank you. Steve.
Thank you, Chair. As Stephen Moyers, the Chief Executive's response to me will be included in the notes. Can we also include the actual line that was the question, which is Appendix 3 of this report, and the actual response relating to that are due to attention, so that people can A, look at Stephen Moyers' response, and B, look at the consultation question and then the paragraph relating to that consultation question that was in the printed documents. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I think what I'm going to say, I mean, this set of papers, this is the first iteration of a number of meetings that scrutinise the budget and then come back to the Strategy, Resources and Performance Committee prior to the budget going on to full council. I'm sure there will be a number of changes to these papers as they travel on that journey. It's possible that some wording may be found that you and Stephen will be both happy with by the time we get to the end of that process. So I'm going to suggest that we leave that one there. Graham.
Thank you, Chair. In view of Councillor Count's earlier comments about savings, could the Chief Executive or other directors comment on the potential savings which are listed in numerous places in the draft budget and express a view on how confident they are in achieving these savings and whether or not these are real savings or they're actual cuts in services? Thank you.
Michael, I'm sure you'll be able to do that for some and probably all of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. And through you, in terms of the process, clearly this is a draft for consultation and for scrutiny, and will come forward to the committee at the end of January, at which point the committee will also have a further report from myself, the Section 25 report, which will give you commentary as the Section 151 officer on the robustness of the estimates and the delivery plans. Clearly, myself with my team have been working through looking at all of the proposals, and we'll continue to do that up to that point, and we'll give the actual clarification at that point. But that will include, looking at previous experiences and the lay of the land in the next 12 months and what we're expecting at that point, because clearly there is some level of uncertainty. The latter part of the question, in terms of the proposals, there is a range that are set out at table 3 that focus on both efficiencies as well as income. redesigning the way that the council works, reassessment of demand. So I advise and implore that councillors and those going through the papers review that table 3, because that's where you'll find the detail in terms of each of the specific savings.
Is that a sufficient answer for today, Graham? Just to
That's-
say that all of the savings will be examined in more detail in the
That's
committee.
sufficient answer for today, and I look forward to the greater explanation in January. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any further, Steve?
Yes, just to point out that we're at the same point in the cycle that we are every year. First of all, we don't have the full announcement by government, which is imminent. So that may or may not change what's presented in future committees. We still have a couple of months before we actually get to February, where we get actually any changes in the overall spectrum of what's happening this year. As you're fully aware from previous years, we will be putting forward an amendment. So it's too early for that amendment to come forward whilst you're still deciding what the joint administration will do. So therefore, this is not our business plan. None of this is our business plan. I'll be voting against this today on all levels, as is usual, because we will present an alternative business plan or an amendment to your business plan at the meeting of full council in February.
Thank you for that clarity. And that's absolutely correct that this is before we've seen the full detail of the local government settlement, and there will undoubtedly be changes to some of the figures in response to that. I'm happy to move to discussion now. Richard.
Thank you. I thought you were about to move the recommendation, so I snuck in, but it is the discussion, not the questions. First of all, I enjoyed Councillor Count's contribution. He's doing his job as leader of the opposition. I don't think we should criticise that at all. I'm a bit worried that he's leaving his Christmas shopping in John Lewis till Christmas Eve with his wife, though. You know, do it a bit earlier, Steve, please, please. On the issues about the consultation, you know, we're very careful as councillors to not criticise our officers. They've got a very, very difficult job to do. We should be dealing with the substantive issues, not trying to pick holes in the phrasing of officers. And that should apply to all of us in this room, in all parties. And I hope that, you know, I don't think that should be the focus for further discussion in future. In truth, I think we should focus on the actual issues at hand. On savings, I think the opposition makes some decent points and should scrutinise us. You know, I think if we're honest, the truth is we haven't been able to deliver all the savings that we've wanted to. Let's be honest about that and say it. And also say the reason behind it. The reason behind it is that the financial position has been so tough that in previous years, officers in good faith have brought forward savings proposals and tried to deliver them, and we haven't been able to do it 100%. Well, I think that's life. And that's, you know, that is to the credit of our officers that they're doing their very best in difficult circumstances. And I'm very happy to be held to account for that, to accept that we haven't got a perfect record on that. Also to note, as you're aware, Chair, that our Chief Executive has brought in even greater stringency this year in the savings proposals. To Michael Hudson and to Stephen Moyer, we should say thank you for that. And hopefully we'll be in a position this time next year where we'll see the savings proposals being better filled, but it won't be 100%. And why not be honest with people and say that rather than pretend that that's in some way a criticism or shortfall of the position. And then 2 or 3 points on adults and social care, as you would expect me to say at this committee. The first thing, in the settlement on Thursday, I don't have any inside knowledge at all, but what appears to be the case is that there's going to be much less ring fencing of social care and much less apply for this grant, apply for that grant and jump through this hoop, and much more just build it into the core amount of money that comes to local government. And actually that will be welcome because it does divert a lot of officer time, which would be better spent delivering services to people to jumping through those hoops. So I think that's the right thing if they do that. But it does put extra emphasis on this committee and on the council in making some very difficult decisions about how we meet our social care needs vis-a-vis the other needs that we have. And so I think it's important to share that with you. The second point is really quite ironic. So we took a difficult decision to say that we would meet the real living wage and have a really significant wage increase for lower paid workers, and that affects people across the council, not just social care, but it particularly affected staff in our contractors, over 90% of whom now in the social care field do pay the real living wage thanks to our policies. And what's very interesting this year is with the government coming in and raising the national living wage, the gap between the national living wage and the real living wage is much less, which is good for the government, if you excuse me saying that. But it's actually good for us because the amount of increase is less than it would have been otherwise. So we've given people a good pay increase, and actually we are now reaping some of the dividends for that in this budget. So, and also, by the way, the employers' national insurance increase, which I accept is politically more contentious and the opposition will definitely oppose, but the biggest cost of that is with the lowest paid staff. So again, we're cushioned from the impact, some of the impact, by no means all, but some of the impact because we've been paying staff at a higher rate. And we should celebrate that and say it because it's a difficult decision we took, and it is the outcome of that. The final point, and it was said in the previous report, is about adult social care demand, and particularly demand for older people. I know you, Chair, and our Vice Chair, the Labour Group leader, have been involved with me in detailed consideration around the savings that are planned on older people's services. With Councillor Bowden across the table, in the Adults and Health Committee, we've had very, very long and serious discussions about this. So I'm not asking to replay all of that. But I do think for people who are not involved in this, it's important to put on record that our demand forecast for the needs that come from older people are being dramatically reduced. That isn't a cut in Councillor Wilson's terms. That's not a cut. We're meeting all of the services for the people that are coming forward, but it is making a major saving in the budget. They're rebaselining. That's what Michael, he'll be proud of me for using the word rebaselining because that's one of their words, not one of ours, but they're rebaselining it. And this is what I want to say about it. We're continuing to look at what are the underlying reasons behind that. If things change, we'll come back and tell people. I am totally confident that officers in adults and health are drilling down as deeply as possible in that, as they should be doing, because we need to really assure ourselves that it's not about people coming forward because there's some barrier to accessing our service and that there are people with need out there that's not being met. And it is genuinely we're meeting needs because sadly the death rate post-COVID has been much higher. And it's a fact of life as well that elderly people and their families are choosing less to go into residential care, which is on balance more expensive because they're worried about what happens when you're in residential care homes after the experience of COVID. That looks to be the reason behind it. But it's important to place on record, this is such a big amount of money and it's so important to the budget overall. I didn't want this debate to pass today without having a chance to air it and to make sure that members who are not involved in the policy area are very fully aware of what's going on there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richard. Lots of really important points there. Chris.
Thank you, Lucy. I hadn't planned to speak on this matter, but given the comments which have just been made, I thought it would be appropriate to do so. And it's quite correct that there have been some considerable discussions which have taken place within the Adults and Health Committee, as there should be. And I also very much reinforce the comment made that we're not here talking about cuts in services. We're talking about something which is a financial matter to do with projections and the extent to which those projected figures turn out not to match reality. The first thing I want to say is I don't blame officers for the fact that the projections that were made for the budget in 24-25 for the need for long-term accommodation, permanent accommodation, both on learning disability and older people. I'm not blaming officers for getting that wrong. They were faced with a very difficult position, particularly on older people. There was a massive shake-up which took place in the whole market, in the whole of the country. This isn't something, by the way, which is unique to Cambridgeshire, very far from it. If it were unique to Cambridgeshire, we might have rather more serious conversations to be had about access and whether we were blocking something in some way. But this pattern is being seen right across the country. And post-COVID, it was expected that there would be an upturn in demand for permanent accommodation, particularly as far as older people were concerned. And despite the best efforts, not merely here in Cambridgeshire of officers, but across the country of similar officers, that expectation turned out not to be accurate. So we have ended up, and I know we're not all the way through the year 24-25, but we're far enough through to see which way things are going. We've ended up in a situation where we have provided for significantly greater demand than actually materialized. And I think it really has to be emphasized that is not a cut in services. And it's all too easy for a false narrative to emerge as a result of that. But what we now need to be aware of and careful of is that we don't find ourselves going in the other direction. If we had had an underestimate of demand, then everyone would be screaming from the rooftops saying how we overspending by so much. It's very important that the exercise in estimating demand is done as rationally as possible, as dispassionately as possible, but also with appropriate sensitivity analysis put into the process, so that it can be seen what risk is being taken on board in terms of the assessments which are being made. And I'm not confident that that sensitivity analysis has been done to a great extent in the past. And I certainly think that that sensitivity analysis needs to be brought to members' attention so that members can see the risk which is being taken on both sides. This isn't a one-sided risk, but the members can understand the risk that is being taken, that we may end up with a figure which is, as in this year, significantly different from the budget figure. So I think it would assist all members of the council, not merely members of the administration, but all members of the council, to have some idea of the sensitivity effect of the estimates which are being made about demand for full-time care places, particularly as far as adults are concerned, but also learning disability, given the large amounts of money which is involved in that. And the reason I think it's really important for us to pay a significant amount of attention to what might sound like a rather abstruse area, a rather technical area of debate, is the amount of money which is involved here. When you're talking about amounts which are getting into, you're talking a significant proportion, the overwhelming proportion of the budget that we've got for adult services, I think it's vitally important that we pay the appropriate amount of attention to that. The one thing which I'm quite confident about is that officers will not get their estimate right. It would be an absolute fluke if they did get the estimate right. The point that we need to emphasize is we need to understand, assuming that it's not exactly right, what is the effect that there will be upon our achievement of budget next year if those estimates are significantly or even slightly wrong. I would like to hold officers to account about their estimates on the day that the administration provides our officers with a crystal ball. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, really, I'll pick some of those points up later, but really helpful discussion. Mark.
Yeah, thank you. Similar to Chris, I'm moved to speak when wasn't really expecting to, and I'm not on adults and health, but I'm very close to it, and I just wanted to share something and ask it to be taken into consideration. It's often good to personalise a story, and I have an 85-year-old father who's been in a care home for 2 years, and he's got Lewy bodies dementia, and it's tough. Yeah, everybody knows it's tough. But there's a kind of good news story here, which has a knock-on negative effect for the council. My father went into care home as a self-funding resident, and his money's decreasing at a rate of knots. And what's going to happen is, due to the wonderful care he's had at the care home and the wonderful care that he gets on his quite regular visits to Adam Brooks after a fall or whatever it is, he's actually living longer with quite an advanced case of dementia than was expected. So actually, his money's going to run out. So the burden of Dad's care then becomes the burden of this room and this county. Now, my point is, using my father as an example, Barry's doing very well out of it. He's got a fantastic quality of care from the care home, etc., and bless his heart, he's completely oblivious as to whether he's got a 5 or 5,000. He hasn't got a clue. So that's a good position to be in. But my point is, and I think this is something we have to take in consideration if we don't already, because I think it's going to be a positive growing problem for the council, and that is due to the wonderful care and due to the increasing care that's available, particularly in the dementia and Alzheimer's field, people are remaining longer with the disease. It's invariably not the disease that takes them. It's another bodily function that will say goodbye to them. But I think it's something that we need to know, and actually that's something that we probably need to make sure that we've got a real handle on, because like my dad, I still hope he's here for many years. But the reality is he's going to be here way past expectations. When he was first diagnosed, which is about 3 years ago, the expectation he was given was 3 to 4 years. Well, a diagnosis last week is 3 to 4 years from now. Because he is progressively going downhill, but there are so much more care available to him. So hopefully that point is valid in as much as, that has a knock-on effect to us. And my dad's name's Barry, just to personalise him. There's a lot of Barrys out there in that situation that are coming towards that end where he just hasn't got the pot of money left, and somebody's got to pick up that care burden for him. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mark, for sharing that. I'm sorry to hear about your father. My grandfather and uncle both died of Alzheimer's disease horribly young, and dementia is such a difficult thing for families to deal with. It's
Chair, but again, through you, if I can just come back, thank you for your comments. I genuinely make that comment to look at the knock-on effect to us and the fact that there's thousands of families, probably hundreds of families in Cambridgeshire who are in my situation. And that burden will get picked up by county. And I just don't want us to lose sight of that because of the good work of the NHS and everybody else that's involved, there's going to be more Barrys in this situation where they need paid for care.
Thank you. Any further comments on the papers? Yes, Elisa.
Thank you. I'm very, very sorry, Chair. It's that time of year where I croak. So let's see how let's see how well we manage to croak. I think in general, so first of all, it is important to note that while obviously, there's been discussion about whether or not we have a crystal ball and whether or not we can predict demand in terms of not just adults, but also I feel we haven't had quite as much discussion about children as we have about adults. We don't need to necessarily, but where we might have had an underestimation or in reality, there are some services on which we are experiencing massively increased pressure and even more than we thought we were going to. And these high cost placements for some of our children are being, they're being quite difficult for us to deal with. But first of all, in terms of the comments that have been made, I don't think, there are a lot of Barrys out there, but there are a lot of Barrys everywhere. We have a country where birth rates are declining and the population is aging. And I can't remember where it was, but I think in the last 20 years, we've gone from 20 working people per retired person in this country to about 3. And, this is only going to get worse. I'm afraid. So this will come as an increased pressure, not just on us, but on every social care authority, whichever way the government decides to reorganize them, which is interesting in its own right. But I also want to point out that whilst I don't think there's anybody in this room who's perfectly comfortable with this budget, in the sense that things have been tighter than we wanted them to be, We have more uncertainty than we would like, and we certainly have had to make more savings than we would have liked. But there are some decisions that we have taken earlier in this administration where the benefit is really coming to fruition now. And I don't know where we would have been if we didn't have the advantages, both in terms of tax, but also in terms of retention that we have, because we decided early on that we would pay our staff more and that we would encourage our contractors to pay the staff more. These things have had a real and tangible impact, and I think we would have been in a much worse position. We've also been a lot more prudent in forecasting for not just for the costs, but also for the income of some of our community energy projects, which I think is very important to note, because actually that has an impact on essentially what the budget gap figure actually is. And, there are millions of pounds in that, which I think it is very important to note that by being prudent and being accurate in our forecasting, we have actually made our situation a lot better than it could have been. And when the budget gaps are that high, not having an accurate way of forecasting and how the allocation of the income goes for every year can have quite a lot of impact. So those things are very important. And whilst we are in an uncomfortable situation, a tight situation, I think if we hadn't done what we've done 2-3 years ago, we would have been in a much worse situation. Again, sorry for croaking.
Thank you, Elisa. I hope your voice gets better soon, just as I hope my back does. Thank you. I don't see any further hands. I've got a couple of comments that I want to make, and then I am fairly certain that this one is for noting to consider. Lovely. Okay. The first and most important thing I want to say, and I will probably come back to it at the end, is to say thank you to all of the officers across the whole council who have worked really hard this autumn to get us to this position. I think that we've had almost a decade now of single-year settlements for local government, and single-year settlements are a nightmare for local government. I mean, it's really difficult setting local council budgets because of all the difficulty of predicting demand that we've just heard from, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But that difficulty is compounded by not getting settlements or not having longer term funding and clarity, particularly when year after year after year, your funding is only clear on the 19th of December and you have to set your budget in January. I mean, it is a nightmare for local government finance people. And because it's a nightmare for them, it's actually a nightmare for many, many of our staff who are juggling really complex budgets. And I want to thank them for all the work that's gone into this budget, to getting this budget to this point this year. I also want to draw attention to one or two of the really huge risks that this council is managing, and which are kind of sucking money away from things that we would prefer to be spending money on. And the biggest of those at the moment is the waste contract that we are dealing with, where a very, very unfortunate PFI deal was signed some time ago, which has left this council facing huge risks, because every time there is a change in legislation around the disposal of waste, the consequences of that for this council are vast. It's one of a number of contracts which I think many of us very much wish had not been signed, or assumptions around costs that had not been made, that we are still dealing with, but the waste one is by far the largest. And I hope that during the coming year we will manage to get to more certainty around those costs, but the risks are huge. The second thing I wanted to say was, kind of picks up on the really, really helpful and very collaborative and constructive discussion that we had about managing, predicting demography in the field of social care. And I think we've had quite a really useful comments from Richard about the the assumptions we're making about increased demography in older people's care, and I'm grateful to the officers for all the work that they've done on that. I think that post-pandemic, the impact of the pandemic on older people's care versus working age people and younger people's care has been very different from what people would have expected. And that's very visible in our council's budgets, in that the budget for older people's care, we've estimated the demography in a direction which we put more money into that budget, and actually the place where costs have risen most rapidly and need has risen most rapidly has actually been in children's social care, and you can see that in our children's budgets, which are under enormous pressure. And again, as has been mentioned on a number of occasions, this is not a Cambridgeshire County Council issue, this is a national issue, but it is causing us huge problems. I think those were the two main things that I wanted to say. And I am grateful to the discussion that there's been around this table. I think it's been a really constructive and useful conversation today. I absolutely understand that there will be different priorities from opposition members, from joint administration members, and those priorities will be discussed during January and then during the budget setting process. But thank you very much to our officers for giving us a really solid foundation for having those political debates in January. And thank you to everyone who's contributed to the discussion today, which I think has been a good, useful discussion. On which point I think we can say that we've considered those, and we will move on to the next item on the agenda. Thank you all. And particularly, again, thanks to Michael and his team and all the work that they've done with multiple officers across the council. And Stephen, in fact, sorry, I shouldn't just say Michael, you've worked on it. Right. The next item on the agenda, I think, is the Treasury Management Q2 update. So Stephen Howarth is back. Thank you.
Hello again. So this report sets out the detailed Treasury management position of the Council as at the end of Q2, which is September of 2024-25. In Q1 and Q3, the key Treasury indicators were included in the management accounts, but at Q2 and at year end, it's a requirement that our Treasury position is considered in detail by this committee and then by full Council as well. The report covers the Council's cash management, borrowing and investments over the year to date, and sets out the position against the key prudential indicators and limits. So taking that last point first, the table at 3.2 of the report shows the Council generally in compliance with the prudential indicators, with only the estimated minimum revenue provision for capital expected to exceed the budgeted level for reasons that are set out in the report. In particular, we are within the debt limit set by Council, and I can provide assurance to committee following previous comments here that the maturity structure of borrowing limits in that table are being revisited as part of the updated Treasury management strategy for the next year to provide narrower limits, and that will come before this committee and full Council in due course. At this point of the year, the total level of the Council's external borrowing is close to the position it was at the start of the year, but we're seeing the interest rates for borrowing are higher than anticipated. The Council continues to generally take out shorter-term debt for refinancing and new borrowing in anticipation of lower rates in the medium term, and that borrowing is a mix of loans from the Public Works Loan Board and from other local authorities. Then finally, the Council's Treasury investments are generally performing well due to the same relatively high interest rates, though we are reducing cash balances down closer to our minimum level to defer taking out higher cost borrowing. And the report gives some detailed information about our collective investment funds, from which dividends continue to perform well, and lists the counterparties with whom the Council has deposits. But I'll leave the intro there. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Chris.
Thank you, Lucy. If I may ask a couple of unrelated questions, please, I'd be grateful. The first relates to Table 4, which we have under paragraph 5.9, which shows the investment maturity profile at the end of Q2. And always interesting to see this, but it is very much, I appreciate, a one-off it's a very brief analysis showing exactly what the position was on one particular day. And I looked at this and I was a little bit surprised by the numbers which I saw, but I have to appreciate it is just one day, that is the 30th of September. And anyone involved in Treasury management will understand that the demands which there are in terms of treasury management literally change almost on a day-by-day basis. So taking one particular day and starting to ask questions about that can be extremely misleading. What would be really helpful, I think, to our better understanding of the treasury management function that we've got so far as our investment maturity profile is concerned, is for us to understand what the average position is over a quarter, not just what the position was on one particular day at the end of the quarter. And that way, we can see, I think, more clearly the extent to which we are relying, as we are here on this one particular day, of a third of the available funds being put on overnight deposit, rather than necessarily it being over a greater period of time. And I'd have been less unhappy about this, and I fully accept it's one particular day, so it's not necessarily typical of the whole quarter. If I'd seen more in the 0 to 3 month period, I would understand that calculations were being done to ensure that where it was understood that there would be a requirement for cash in 2 months' time, that we were investing at an appropriate position. What's been more difficult on that, of course, is not seeing from this report what the average return is for the different levels, for the different periods of maturity. Now, if there were, and it's never the case, but if there were no difference in terms of the yield to be had at different levels of maturity, then my question would be absolutely meaningless. And paradoxically, it can be the case that sometimes the short-term yield is actually much better than the long-term yield. But we don't have any of that information available to us here, nor, as I say, do we have the average position during the course of a quarter. I'm absolutely confident that this information is available because I'm quite confident we've got a very professional treasury management function, but we're not seeing really what is happening other than this snapshot of one day in the quarter. May I request the consideration be given to giving us average figures as well as the quarter end figure, so that we can see what's happening during the course of a quarter?
Stephen.
I can absolutely say we'll look into that. Certainly, they're probably good suggestions, and we're always looking for ways to make sure that this information is as useful as possible to members of this committee. I will say on table 4, the slightly unusual distribution of that does reflect what you said, Councillor Bowden. I think that at the moment we're seeing quite good rates on overnight rates, particularly on the money market funds, such that it's almost not worth putting into some of the shorter dated deposits. Might as well just have the money overnight. But yeah, we'll look at those two suggestions around averages and average returns for the different maturity brackets.
I'm grateful for that information. I have to say that I don't watch the money markets on a day-by-day basis, so I'm not in a position to be able to make the same judgment which has just been made. I'm quite confident those judgments are being made and being made properly. I'd just like to be able to see the numbers to confirm that. Sorry.
I was just going to ask Chris, do you want a short note to come out after this meeting to clarify that in writing, or are you happy with the?
I'm happy with it being taken away by officers to be able to be dealt with.
Thank you.
My second question is a rather different one, and I feel sorry for officers who have to produce these Treasury management reports, not in terms of reporting back about what has happened, but in their projections about what will happen in the future. It's coming back to the same question of projections for future figures. And it's a very difficult thing to be done. If anyone were able to do it perfectly, then of course they wouldn't be working for a local authority, or we wouldn't be councillors. We'd be sunning ourselves in the Bahamas, raking in the cash. In practice, what local authorities end up doing, and we do it ourselves, is we rely on the market, we rely on, quote, experts, unquote, to be able to give us advice for us to make our decisions. And whilst that doesn't work out perfectly, any alternative is likely to be much more negative in terms of the final outcome that we have. So nevertheless, despite knowing that, I read through this report with interest, the first 14 pages of the report, thinking, I wonder how this story is going to end up. And unfortunately, the story wasn't able to be resolved because the resolution in terms of the forecasts, particularly the interest rate forecasts in paragraph 8, was somewhat contradictory. If I may just read out, Lucy, what was said, it is said quite correctly that the Bank of England has initiated its easing cycle by lowering interest rates from 5.25% to 5% in August. however, held them steady in its September meeting, signalling a preference for a more gradual approach to rate cuts. And that's exactly where we all thought we were 2 months ago. Since then, we've had the budget, which has not gone down particularly well with the markets and with the real economy out there. And we've also had other matters such as the Monetary Policy Committee meeting on the 7th of November and the US presidential result as well, all of which have changed market sentiment rather substantially. I think we all had been expecting, as is mentioned in this report, that there would be a gradual reduction in interest rates through 24 and through to the end of 25. And when you're in a situation where interest rates are expected gradually to fall, then you make decisions about your short-term and long-term, both borrowing and investing based on that, quite correctly. However, since this report was written, and it's even mentioned in here, it says, however, Link's central forecast was still for rates to fall to 4.5% by the end of 24, with further cuts likely throughout 25. And then we have the killer line, this now seems unlikely and has been updated mid-November following the budget and so on. Now, that is rather important. As Stephen was just saying before, we've been taking out short-term debt in the expectation of continuing reductions in interest rates. That expectation is disappearing fast. It's certainly not as substantial as it was 2 months ago, and it may well be that that expectation will reverse much, much earlier than any of us had been expecting only a couple of months ago. So having the denouement of this report saying that this now seems unlikely, I thought I just would think that it would be helpful for that to be expanded slightly for an updated estimation of just where interest rates look likely to be going based on what the market is saying, and what effect that will have on, for example, our continuing to take out short-term debt in the expectation of continuing interest rate cuts. And it's not merely on the money that we invest where these decisions need to be made, but also on the money we borrow and the refinancing of short-term maturing loans. And the numbers involved can end up being really substantial indeed. To some extent, the two elements, that is both the money we earn and the money we pay out in borrowing, to some extent there is some offset between the two, unless one is not as competent as one should be, in which case one can lose out on both sides. So given the fact, as is stated here, that this now the previous expectation now seems unlikely, I wonder if some expansion can be given to this committee about what now seems likely and how that might affect the way in which we are taking out short-term debt and what we're doing so far as our potential borrowing is concerned in the future.
I mean, essentially, the central projections are that as you say, as the report says, that the decrease that we're expecting to happen is unlikely. So we're expecting it to remain more stable, if not increase in the short term. I should say we're getting towards the end of Q3, so there'll be a further update coming relatively soon to the committee. Ultimately, though, I don't think this will change our Treasury advisor's main advice to us, which will be that over the medium term, we would still expect rates to begin to decrease, and therefore taking out relatively short-dated debt is likely to still be the best course of action to reduce the risk of locking in high, or what feels like high, interest rates for a longer period. So looking at the medium term of, say, over the next 4 to 5 years, the projections are still that the interest rates would start to come down.
Not trying to predict the future, Lucy, but given that comment, surely it will make more sense for us to look for medium-term debt rather than short-term debt if we are expecting that there will be a short-term increase, but longer-term we're going to see a decrease. So it should change our appetite when we are facing this upturn, which was unexpected, in interest rates.
It's possibly the slightly vague use of the word short and medium term between us, but so we do take out. I'm currently looking to take out debt that's in sort of the 2 to 4 year window, as well as just, if we were talking about 2 years ago, we were taking a lot of our debt out pretty much for 1 year only. We're taking out some short-term, very short-term debt like that for local authorities, but we are taking out slightly more medium-term, less short-term, 2 to 4 year debt with places like PWLB. So we're not talking about borrowing beyond the medium term in terms of the length of debt, but we are, as you'd expect, having a bit of a mixture of the very short-term stuff and a bit more in the medium term.
Thank you. I've got Edna and then Steve, and forgive me, I'm going to stand up for a few minutes, but I will continue to chair the meeting.
Thank you. I probably should have sort of made my comment when we were discussing the Integrated Finance Monitoring Report, but it does apply to this area as well, although perhaps not quite as strongly because it is very much about what's happening now. In general, it's really difficult to assess performance unless you have some historical information. And we typically don't have that for this committee. We are in the year and budget versus actual in the year. But the best way to assess what's happening in the year is by seeing where we were last year and where we were the year before, budget versus actual. And I mean, I have raised this on previous occasions, and I suppose I'm just making a plea if we could perhaps give some thought into including that, particularly for the Integrated Finance Monitoring Report in future. Thank you.
Yes, we'll certainly take that on board for this report and look at the IFMR as well. I think we following a comment probably about a year ago, I think we do include a bit more historical information in the IFMR as an appendix. But again, as with Councillor Bowden, it's useful to have feedback from members on what would make this report, which is quite technical and dense, more useful to you, is very helpful. So we'll look to do that. Yes.
Can I just clarify? Really, it's more important, I think, for the IFMR, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Steve.
Thank you, Chair. And like Councillor Bowden, I just wanted to comment on really that chapter about 8 and making the difficulties, because since the Labour budget, as this central forecast predicts, that the impact on mortgage rates, or sorry, Bank of England rate, instead of falling to 4.5, is likely to be stagnated at the moment. We'll find out in the near future whether that is or not. And that has a real impact, not just on us, but on households, and the fact that Labour government's budget has actually added cost onto the average mortgage holding household. This is compounded by the fact that the energy prices, they've allowed a higher cap on that. The lack of wage increases caused by the National Insurance Employers' Contribution. There are a huge multitude of complex effects, both on the household budget, but also on the money markets. We see the Bank of England Committee, the Monetary Policy Committee, will be moving forwards, considering where we are with inflation, which is their only key measurement, whilst at the same time, every indicator is now that the country is being driven into a recession, with the first month actually out into minus figures. And what's scary about that is, whilst the monetary policy is being driven by inflation, and we've seen so many inflationary measures come forward recently from whilst the Labour government's been in power, at the same time, our whole economy could be going into recession, which will make it difficult for the monetary policy to reduce interest rates whilst the inflation rates go higher and higher. At the same time, we see Keir Starmer renegotiating the Brexit deal with Europe, trying to give away our rights. At the same time, as Europe itself has got multiple political and financial difficulties, and the thought of going back in there and realigning ourselves when we left, when the election came over, UK was the highest increase in GDP in the whole of the G7. So it's very worrying. I don't know where it's going to go forward, but in actually handling it, going on to more constructive things than just politically criticising the appalling way the Labour government has started their legacy, in more constructive way, I look at the prudential and treasury indicators, and we talk about what is the difference between our returns on our investment and the cost of our debt, and how that can move with time. And it's actually that you could end up with being worse off than both if matters are handled in a poor way. And I think that whilst we leave a lot of day-to-day decision making to the very competent officers who are much more skilled than I am at looking at that, we could rein in their ability to affect that more and actually de-risk that as slightly by actually looking at our planned minimums and maximums in our TMS. If we actually reduce the flexibility there on the areas that they're allowed to operate in, whilst the rewards may be lower, the risk is de-risked to a certain extent. And I suggest that perhaps that's something that we as members would like to have a deep dive in, an actual session on outside of the committee, so we can actually understand that a bit more and see if there is flex for us to actually restrict the parameters of operation a little bit further than they are at the moment, not because it doesn't give the best possible chance of financial return, but it gives the best possible chance of de-risking this organisation. Thank you, Chair.
I had a feeling there might be some people who might want to comment after that, including me. Richard.
I thought the second part of what Councillor Counts said was very constructive. I'd also like to place on record my thanks to Councillor Bowden, who in 2 interventions now has made some very interesting and constructive points, and I thank him for that. On the first part of what Councillor Counts said, I'm not going to answer all the points. I just think that Councillor Count isn't Christmas shopping in John Lewis. He's going to second-hand shops and he's just shopping for the same arguments that Conservatives are putting in Parliament and repeating them here. So keep out of the second-hand shops, please, Councillor Count. And if people watching this committee on YouTube really want to hear those arguments, just tune into Prime Minister's questions. You can get them firsthand, and I don't think we need to trouble this council by repeating them here.
Okay, I'm going to make some comments on my own. First on Christmas shopping, because I would really like to encourage as many people to go shopping in second-hand shops as possible. They are really, really good. You get fantastic bargains and it's better for the environment. So please do your Christmas shopping. Much though I love John Lewis, please do your Christmas shopping in second-hand shops. Secondly, on renegotiating Brexit, I mean, I think if there's anything that's going to help this council, help this country and get growth going, it will be looking for a better Brexit deal. I mean, the Conservatives' Brexit negotiations have been absolutely catastrophic, and there are dozens and dozens, hundreds, thousands of small businesses in this country, in this county, and in this country who are having a nightmare time this Christmas because exporting to Europe has just become even more difficult. So I wasn't going to go there, but given that Steve took us there, that was my thoughts on that. I think probably we've got quite a long way from the Treasury Management document, though. I am really grateful for all the comments that there have been on it. It's good to spend some time thinking about our Treasury Management document. And I think the points that have been raised about making sure that we've got some slightly some additional information in there next time, looking at a slightly longer period, would be really helpful. So thank you for those. I think this paper was also to note for consideration before it goes to council. So I think we've done that. Thank you very much. We will move on to item 7, which is the corporate performance report. And I think that Sue is joining us online. There we are, as if by magic. Hello, Sue. Thank you for joining us. And I'm sorry you're still not feeling well.
That's okay. That's okay. It goes with the season. I have tried to brighten things up with the colour of my dress, though. But thank you, Chair, and good morning, committee. You have in front of you the Q2 performance report for the period from July through to September of this year. The cover report and the appendix sets out the performance against the key indicators that are relevant for this committee. The report is still in the format that members of this committee will be familiar with. Following the revised performance management framework, which was approved in October at this committee, I just want to assure members of the committee that work is now taking place across all directorates to develop their scorecards, which will then be considered at the policy and service committees, and so that you will see the revised organisational scorecard coming through at a future meeting of this committee. In the meantime, this report summarises the status of the indicators. you'll see that we have 10 that are at green or blue status, and we have one red indicator in this quarter relating to freedom of information responses. This was discussed at the last meeting of this committee, and as you'll have noted from the action log today, work is underway to benchmark our performance against other authorities, and that information will be coming through to committee members. But I'm pleased to say that that indicator is moving in the right direction. The committee is asked to note this report, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sue. Questions on the report? Steve.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Sue, for this good report. I've got a particular question on 3.5, indicator 182, which is the proportion of freedom of information requests. It's got a sentence in there. It says, there is a continued high level of request on contentious issues relating to highways in particular. Could you explain the nature of those requests, please?
Thank you. I think I'd have to take that away, Steve, to get more detail on the nature of the requests relating to highways or other things that might be deemed to be contentious. But yes, if you're happy for me to take that away and take that to the service, then I'll follow that up. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that, Sue. I mean, there is a bit more information. It says that we don't really know if it's gone to another subject or not. It says the process has begun around publishing data on potholes to address the higher level of requests on that topic. I can only assume, and I've seen so many of examples of this in my own inbox, where somebody has burst a tyre on one of the many potholes that this county has around its county. And then they've gone on to say, how do I get an insurance claim on this? So I help them out. I tell them where the form is. I tell them how to fill it in. And then the response they get is, no, we can't pay you because we are repairing this within our timescales. And then they go back and they say, well, what does that mean? And they say, well, if it gets reported to us and we repair it within X days, then you aren't entitled to a claim. And this is followed up in various instances that I'm aware of, where they say, prove that that was the data that came in, prove that it was inspected when it's supposed to be inspected, and prove that you've dealt with it in time. And the ones that I've seen are very, very contentious indeed. And this creates a huge amount of work internally for us. So I await your answer, but I suspect we already know the answer to this. There are far too many potholes causing punctured tyres, and people aren't happy when they're told that the county council isn't to blame.
Noted. I'm not going to get involved in that particular discussion in relation to this paper. Any folks? Chris.
Thank you, Lucy. 3 indicators I'd just like to mention. 2 of them are just for the sake of mentioning it. I'm not expecting any change to take place. It is disappointing that we're failing to meet our target of freedom of information requests responded to within the statutory timescale, and that we are also failing to meet our target of for the percentage of subject access requests which are completed within the statutory timescales. That's disappointing, and I'm sure work will be done by officers to try and improve that. A throwaway comment, I'm just a little bit surprised that our target for fulfilling the requirement within statutory timescales is 90%. Shouldn't our target be 100% of completing within statutory timescales? That wasn't the main thing I wanted to speak about, but I'm just throwing that in there for officers to consider. If there is a statutory timescale, surely we should expect to meet it. What really struck me was indicator 187, the proportion of staff feeling engaged as demonstrated through employee engagement survey. And it struck me because the actual graph which is provided doesn't give us any real information at all. So I just looked at that more carefully, and it suggested that all the previous data we've had from previous years isn't really comparable, so that isn't being shown. I'm not going to argue about that. It is just disappointing that we're not really being given much information. I'm also honestly surprised that the figure is as low as 55% of staff who feel engaged. The impression I had, and some of the results that we see elsewhere in this report, led me to believe that the figure would be a lot higher than 55%. So I just wonder, maybe this is a matter maybe for the head of paid service. I just wonder if my surprise at this figure is shared and what it is that we can do to try and improve it. And I read this with a little bit of concern as well, because I note that, and again, I may be misreading it, but I note that, not surprisingly, not every single member of staff responded. Only 54% of staff responded. And of those 54%, my understanding is only 55% felt they were engaged. So presumably the other 46% who didn't respond were even less engaged because they didn't even respond to the engagement survey. So is the real position even worse than we're being told here? And sorry I made that a little bit lighthearted, but it just seems that there's an issue here which I didn't expect and I don't understand. And I wonder, particularly if the head of paid service can give some response to that, I'd be really grateful.
Thank you, Chair. That would be me then. So thank you to Councillor Bowden for the comments and the questions. A couple of points I would like to offer. First of all, the previous data and information that was used for this indicator was not comparable. Members of this committee may remember that we undertook the first all-employee survey of the County Council in 2023, which was the first time for a considerable number of years where we'd actually invited views from the entirety of the workforce. Whilst the response rate was, as Councillor Bowden suggested, 54%, the 46% non-response doesn't mean lack of engagement. It just means chose not to respond. May have been people on holiday, people off sick. Equally, got to recognise that many of our staff don't have day-to-day access to digital systems given the nature of their work, such as our reablement teams in social work, so getting time and access for them to be able to complete the survey is also quite a challenge. In terms of the overall engagement level that was measured through that survey, whilst it's still statistically significant, it's clearly not where we would want it to be. But there is a high degree of variation across the Council's directorates and services, which I think members of this committee have previously had a briefing note upon, which indicates that some areas of the Council, for example, Sue's directorate in strategy and partnerships, considerably higher level of engagement compared to the average figure that's presented here. As members will also be aware, the County Council has an approved people strategy or workforce strategy, which has an underpinning action plan with a series of steps that are designed to improve engagement from our workforce. At the last Staffing and Appeals Committee chaired by Councillor Murphy, there was actually an extensive series of presentations. I think Councillor Count was also in attendance at that meeting, which were outlining many of the things that our HR service, supported by line management, are doing on areas such as learning and development, recruitment, retention, feedback from exit interviews and from new joiners to the council, and a whole host of other activities. So I would actually agree with Councillor Bowden. There is much more positivity across parts of the workforce, but we also recognise that this data provides the holistic view of people's thoughts and experiences at that time. That's why we are planning to undertake a further full employee survey next year, so that hopefully the steps that have been taken since this was undertaken will show more positive engagement across the workforce. I'm sure our Service Director of HR would be very happy to either send a further note to committee or indeed share the information that was presented to the Staffing and Appeals Committee with SRP members. I think that would give you a great deal of confidence in the work that's being undertaken, not least in terms of the experience of many of our staff as reported both when joining and indeed some of the colleagues leaving the organisation, because actually colleagues leaving the organisation is not necessarily a bad thing, and many of them rate us on an online platform known as Glassdoor. Cambridgeshire County Council continues to receive a positive overall view from members of staff that have been employed by or indeed have left the council. And I think that provides us quite real-time information and free text commentary from people in our employment today and indeed who've previously worked for us. So I guess my conclusion, Chair, through you would be lots of work going on, lots that we can describe, and indeed some very helpful reports that we can share with committee that have already been before Staffing and Appeals, if that would be useful. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope.
Thank you, Lucy. Given all that positivity and many things said by the head of paid service, which I share, and given all the other things which are positive, I'm still surprised then that the figure has come out as low as 55%. And my question was, should we be surprised that it's as low as 55%? Does that seem wrong, or is it something which reflects what was expected?
Chair, having undertaken these on multiple occasions in different organisations, I always think a bit like Councillor Bowden's earlier comments in terms of crystal ball gazing. It's very difficult to forecast exactly what you'd expect by way of engagement. The point I would make is that the time at which we did this survey, we were in the process of large-scale separation of services that were previously shared with Peterborough City Council in areas such as children's social care, adult social care and education. I think it would be reasonable to expect that that had some impact upon individuals' views at that time. Equally importantly, since separating those services, I would just make the observation that there have been significant pieces of positive feedback about changes to leadership and support for staff since we repatriated those services to the County Council. Their previous leadership arrangements were, dare I say, in some cases described as toxic. Thank you.
Richard and then Mark.
First of all, I thank Chief Executive for that answer. I won't comment because I think he gave a very full answer. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to look at the results of those engagement exercises and to learn from them in a non-defensive way. But I really wanted to agree with what was said earlier about the freedom of information requests. I think Sue discussed this with us a year ago. It's been a consistent problem. And I think it's fair to comment, as Councillor Bowden has done, that we can and should do better. And I think our administration is trying to change the culture in the organisation. I think we're some way there. But I think, you know, if we're honest, the reason that the timescales are not met is there's a defensiveness amongst our officers, and they don't want to discuss some of the issues which are difficult and which complainants do bring to us. And I think it obscures all those wonderful efforts and the wonderful feedback we're getting on engagement. If when on occasions we get things wrong, we're trying to cover it up rather than be honest about it and address it. And so I hope that we across party in this committee will push the case that freedom of information requests, complaints are part of a good thing, which is democracy and being honest with people, and that we want to see that, and that we are open to criticism, and that we want our officers to share in that culture, which is the one that we are seeking to advance. So I'm quite happy to support the opposition in what they say today on that.
Thank you. Very helpful. Mark.
Yeah, just a quick question on the previous subject of 187. Stephen made some very apt points, but there was something that just I quite missed, which was the point, a very good one, that not all of our paid officers have access to IT and email, etc., etc. So I'm not expecting you to have an answer off the top of your head, but maybe you or Sue could just drop it around to us, which is, so what would you expect as 100% return rate on this? Because with the greatest respect, Steve was using the figure of 46% not, but if it's not 46% and it's 26%, I'd like to know why. Does my question make sense? Yeah.
So Chair, thank you to Councillor Goldsack for the question. Given that we were undertaking this externally facilitated by Ipsos Mori, one of the largest global providers of these types of surveys, which actually also provided input to the NHS annual workforce survey, their expectation on response rates based on other organisations in the public sector is somewhat lower than the response rate we even achieved in Cambridgeshire. If I can say to members that in my last authority, I seem to recall the overall response rate to a similar survey was something like 40%. That was only just at the level that certainly Ipsos Mori would advise provides statistically significant responses. So whilst I agree with Councillor Bowden's contention that 55% engaged, or indeed just over 55% response rate, is something we would want to have at a higher level. I don't think it's, comparatively speaking, the lowest I've seen in the public sector for some considerable time. I would also just make the observation that just as with our residents, our members of staff can feel survey fatigue as well. So we have to manage how many times we ask them questions. Thank you.
If I just come back, nothing there contentious at all, and I agree. And I actually think a lot of these responses, there is a lot of fatigue out there. My specific question was against the point that you raised in response to Chris, which was there's a percentage of our staff that I wouldn't expect a response from. It's that percentage that I'm blind on. Okay, if you don't know that now, that's fine. But if you could perhaps let us know that, that would help us put more balance into these answers. Thank you.
Chair, through you, yes, to Councillor Goldsack, we can follow that up and provide advice outside the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't see any other hands, so I've got a question of my own, Sue. Although it's possible, well, a comment, and I'm not quite sure who might respond to it, you or Michael, because it's on IT. And the indicator in this that such a high, I think it's 98%, but anyway, a huge number of our IT requests are dealt with at the first point of call is a really impressive one. And I would like to thank the staff in IT who I think are often at the front end of somewhat of people's frustration for their efforts on that. I would also like a little bit of reassurance that actually when we say things have been resolved, they've been resolved to the satisfaction of the whoever it was who made the contact, rather than people just giving up and going away. But I'm sure that is the case. Is that for you, Michael? Because that's your patch. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Indicator 195, I think it's the indicator you're referring to, and it is pleasing to see, having gone through a decoupling of that service and the process of that. We do ask for and encourage people to give experience and satisfaction responses afterwards. We don't always get but we do monitor that, and we do get an awful lot of thanks in relation to that. Obviously, the scale and nature of pointing people to how they can reset their own password, to different issues in terms of coffee spilt, or there is a whole range there. So it is something that we do review, and it's pleasing, and I will take it back to the team in terms of your comments. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you. And yeah, please do, because they are a very, very important facilitator for this council, and it's great to see that they're doing such a good job. That's fantastic. I don't see any other questions on this. Again, we're asked to note the performance, so I don't think there's any action to be taken. So thank you all for your comments on that, which I think have been, again, really helpful and constructive. Item 8 on the agenda is the committee agenda plan, training plan, and appointments to outside bodies. Michelle.
Thank you, Chair. The only thing to draw your attention is we've got now the dates on the agenda plan up to mid-2026, and we're working on the training plan for following the election to have items listed for your consideration at your first meeting.
Thank you very much. Richard.
This is on behalf of our colleague Councillor Slatter, who's not in the committee, but she keeps banging away in Adults and Health Committee. But I think with some justice, I think she's on the development group. I don't know what you call it, Michelle, but looking at training needs. And the point that I know she's pushing now, and she's pushed Adults and Health Committee, is that more information should be available now that candidates from the various parties could get access to. We're not necessarily talking about events or programmes, but to provide information openly, and that will improve the quality of the election. I think she makes a fair point about that, and so I will just pass that on. It's her idea, not mine.
Michelle?
Yes, thanks, Councillor Howard. That is a very good point. Just to explain what we're doing, we're having I'm working with Matthew in Communications to put a page on the website early in January for people that are interested in being a candidate. We will also be preparing candidates packs, which will have information about the council itself, and we'll also have details of all the training that will be available, so that candidates are aware of what they're signing up to, and if successful, what they actually need to reserve in their diaries. So it's a very good point. We did take to the member development panel the draft induction programme following the election, so Councillor Slatter is aware of that, and that probably is where some of her questions are coming from.
Just say thank you.
Steve.
Yeah, very helpful suggestion, Councillor Howlett, and thank you for taking this forward. Just some concerns or further suggestions. So first of all, Michelle, when you say so they're aware of everything they sign up for, please don't try to scare too many of them off by being honest and realistic. The second point I want to make is whilst you're preparing candidate packs, which have got a huge amount more detail than actually what some people would like to know when they consider becoming a candidate, would it be possible to get that earlier draft, perhaps on the web page and links? I saw some great presentations by Stephen Moore, what the council does, that PowerPoint, what the council does, how much money, where the money goes, those sort of things that are really that base level of information before we start scaring them off with what they've actually got to do with it. So thank you. And thank you, Councillor Howard, for that suggestion.
I absolutely agree with what Steve says about that.
Yes, to add to that, we are reviewing what we actually put in the candidates pack to more reflect actually what you've just said. And it's a very good point about actually putting that on the web page as well. Thank you.
Can I add one further point on this, which is that thinking about what happens, so that's really helpful discussion about what happens before the elections. After the elections, I know from several previous experiences that there's an enormous amount of training which is then available to people who do get elected. I think it might be useful for Democratic Services to potentially ask some of the sitting councillors now about how that training happens and what things should be done early and what things can wait, because the tendency is always that new councillors get completely drowned in training opportunities, and actually they have a massive amount to deal with, and trying to work out how we pace that would be really helpful.
If I could come back on that point, that's a really good point. And we do take feedback from the questionnaires that we do following the training that we did at the time of the last election. We've had detailed discussions with the member development panel, and the induction programme this time itself is very overarching. We're very conscious of the need not to bombard members with an intensive training programme within the first few months because of the demands on their time. And I think it probably would be useful if we took that programme to shared that programme with group leaders, because it's a much lighter touch approach on the essentials early on rather than bombarding with everything. Hence the importance of the policy and service committees having their training plans and identifying what training is needed, which we can then accommodate further on without trying to get everything done within June and July, which is not appropriate for most members.
Thank you. That's really helpful to know, and I think it would be helpful if that could come to group leaders. So thank you very much. I don't see any further comments or hands. So thank you very much, Michelle. Thank you everyone for what's been a very constructive meeting, and happy Christmas to everybody. See you all in January. Thank you.